She was 41 years old and she had nothing. No home, no savings, no husband, just a single suitcase with a broken zipper and $43 she'd been folding and refolding inside an old birthday card since the day the locks were changed. And with 32 of those dollars, Margaret Calloway bought a house. It was a sagging 2-story cottage at the edge of Ferris Creek, with a porch that had given up trying to be level and a front door the color of old mustard. The neighbors said she'd lost her mind. But what none of them knew, what Margaret herself didn't know yet, was that somewhere inside those warped walls, tucked behind a kitchen baseboard that hadn't been moved in 40 years, was a row of envelopes, and what she found when she counted what was in each one would change the rest of her life. If this kind of story is the kind that stays with you, the kind you think about a little after it's over, this channel is where they live. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more, and while you're at it, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from tonight. It means more than you know. Margaret had not always been the kind of woman who owned a suitcase with a broken zipper. She had grown up in Garland, Ohio, in a house her father had built himself, board by board, over the course of 2 summers. Her mother had planted roses along the south fence that came back every year without being asked. Margaret had been the kind of child who pressed wildflowers between dictionary pages and kept every birthday card in a shoebox under her bed. She had been careful with things. She had believed that if you took care of what you had, it stayed. She met Dennis Calloway at 23 at a function for a company she worked for, and he was visiting. He had a good laugh, and he was steady in the way that some men are steady, the kind you mistake for solid until you realize they are simply slow to move. They married the following spring. Her mother cried. Her father gripped Dennis's hand for a long time at the reception without saying a word, which Margaret had always taken to mean something good. They had 17 years together. She would not call them bad years, even now. They had a home in a neighborhood with oak trees, a vegetable garden that did reasonably well most summers, and a daughter named Claire who had her father's eyes and her mother's way of going quiet when something mattered. Margaret had learned to cook things she liked, and she had a blue kitchen she'd painted herself and a small workbench in the garage where she kept her tools in order. She had friends from work, a walking route she liked, a book group that met on the second Thursday of each month at a house 3 streets over. She was not unhappy. She had been careful, and careful had felt like enough. What they did not have, by the end, was much of anything else. Dennis had made some investments he never fully explained. He had signed some documents she hadn't read carefully, which was her error, and she knew it. But knowing it didn't change the shape of what happened. The investments had not gone well. There had been a second account she hadn't known about. There had been conversations he'd had with people whose names she only learned later, in an attorney's office, over papers that were already signed and already binding. When the marriage ended, quietly, on a Tuesday, with more paperwork than anger, the house went with it. The court had been efficient. So had Dennis. She asked him, once, how he could do it, how he could take the house they had lived in together, the garden, the oak trees, the blue kitchen. He looked at her the way a person looks at a question they have already decided not to answer, and he said, "It's what the paperwork says, Margaret." He did not say he was sorry. He said it twice, in fact. Once in the kitchen and once standing in the driveway with his keys already out, and both times with the same flat patience, as though he was explaining something to someone who simply couldn't follow. She had followed. She understood perfectly. She just did not understand how he could. Her sister offered a couch for 6 weeks. The couch was fine. The 6 weeks stretched. Claire was in college by then, which was its own quiet relief. She didn't have to watch her daughter navigate the particular embarrassment of watching her mother sleep in a living room. Margaret worked. She had always worked. She was a bookkeeper, and she was good at it, and she kept doing it even when she felt hollowed out in ways she couldn't name. She saved. She had the $43 in the birthday card. Actually, she'd started with $60 and spent $17 on bus fare and groceries. And she had a small savings account she'd managed to protect from the paperwork. And she had the fierce, quiet stubbornness of a woman who has decided not to drown. She found Ferris Creek on a Saturday in March, driving with no destination, which she had started doing on weekends because it was cheaper than doing anything else, and sometimes it helped. Ferris Creek was not a town that announced itself. It was the kind of place that appeared between other places. A feed store. A post office with one window. A diner called June's with the A burned out on its sign, so it read Jun's. She stopped for coffee. The woman behind the counter was named Harriet. She was 60 or so, with reading glasses on a chain and the kind of brisk efficiency that comes from decades of making things work. Margaret sat at the counter because the booths all had menus on them, and she didn't want to make it seem like she was staying. They talked, the way people do in diners, about nothing particular, and then about a little more. That cottage on Mill Road's been empty 3 years, Harriet said, refilling the coffee without being asked. Owner passed. No family stepped forward. Town was going to take it for taxes, but somebody paid them, and now the estate's just sitting there. Margaret asked how much. Harriet told her a number so small that Margaret asked again. $1, Harriet said, and you'd have to agree to fix it up within 2 years or it reverts. Town ordinance. Nobody's wanted the trouble. Margaret drove past it on her way out. She did not stop. She turned around at the end of Mill Road and drove past it a second time, slowly. Then she pulled over and sat in the car for 11 minutes with the engine off. The porch was badly listed, sagging at the left corner so severely that the railing leaned outward at a defeated angle. There was a window on the second floor with a crack taped over with masking tape, yellowed to the color of old teeth. The paint on the clapboards had given up in patches, showing the gray wood underneath like a coat worn through at the elbows. The front door, the color of old mustard, had swollen in its frame, judging by the way the weather strip had been forced. There was a chimney that looked sound, but would need pointing. There was a drain pipe hanging away from the eave on one side that someone had zip-tied back provisionally and then apparently forgotten. But the garden, if you could call it that, was a tangle of dead crabgrass and one rose bush that had somehow survived everything, its bare winter canes reaching up through the mess with an air of mild indignation, as if to say, I am still here. She noticed the rose bush. She noticed it particularly. She drove back to her sister's couch. She lay there for a long time in the dark, listening to the refrigerator hum and the traffic on the street outside, and the small sounds of someone else's house doing what houses do at night. Her sister meant well. The couch was fine, but it was not hers. And every morning she woke up in it, she was aware of that fact before she was aware of much else. She sat up. She got her birthday card out of her bag and counted the money inside it one more time, even though she already knew what was there. She counted it anyway, because she was that kind of person, and because sometimes the act of counting a thing is the same as deciding what to do with it. She called the county estate office the following Monday. The man she spoke with was named Gerald, and he was tired in the way that people who handle abandoned property often are, a low-grade exhaustion born of paperwork, and people who ask questions but don't follow through. He told her the terms twice, slowly, as though she might not have the stamina for them. $1 purchase price, he said. You take it as is, meaning whatever structural issues, whatever condition. 2-year improvement window or the property reverts, and you'll need to clear the estate's unclaimed personal effects yourself. The county won't do it." Margaret said she understood. "There's still furniture in there," Gerald said. "Old woman's stuff. Whoever she was, nobody came to claim any of it." Margaret signed the paperwork on a Wednesday. She handed over $32. She'd been wrong about the price. There were administrative fees, and she got a key on a ring with a paper tag that said Millard. She drove to Ferris Creek with everything she owned in the back of a borrowed car, which was not much. The suitcase, 3 boxes of books, her good lamp, and a casserole dish her mother had given her when she'd first gotten married that she had kept through everything, because it still smelled faintly of her mother's kitchen if she held it close. The inside of the cottage was worse than the outside, which is a thing that is often true of houses that have been left alone. The wallpaper in the front room had started to peel at the ceiling corners and come down in long, slow curls like the pages of a wet book. The kitchen floor had a soft spot near the stove that you had to step around or feel your foot go slightly wrong. Every window was original, single pane, and cold to the touch even on a mild day. The bathroom tiles had 2 cracks that hadn't been caulked. The light fixture in the hallway was hanging by its wire and swaying slightly in drafts that had no obvious source. There was a smell, not rot exactly, but the particular smell of a house that has not been breathed in for a while, dust and old wood and the ghost of meals cooked a long time ago. It was not an unpleasant smell once you got used to it. It was the smell of a place that had been lived in and then stopped, waiting. But the furniture was real, heavy, careful furniture. The kind made from wood with actual weight to it, built to last rather than to look good for 5 years and then fall apart. A kitchen table with 6 chairs, all matching. A bookshelf in the front room, still full, Margaret noted, and neatly organized. Fiction on one side and nonfiction on the other, and a collection of local history books standing together at the end of the bottom shelf. A wingback chair by the front window that had been repaired at the seam, carefully, with thread that almost matched. Someone had owned a reading lamp beside it, and there was a circular mark on the side table where the base had stood, and a mark on the floor where the cord had been tucked under the baseboard. Whoever had lived here had taken care of things. That was the first thing Margaret noticed. The curtains were straight. The kitchen shelves were lined with paper. The casserole dishes, 3 of them, stacked, were clean. There was a coffee mug on the counter that said "World's Best Teacher" in letters that had faded to a soft gold, and a pair of reading glasses on the kitchen table beside a crossword that was 3/4 finished, the remaining squares still white and waiting. Margaret stood in the kitchen for a long time. She slept that night in the wingback chair because the bedroom mattress was beyond keeping, and she woke up to a cardinal on the windowsill and a draft coming under the kitchen door that she could feel from across the room. The crossword was still on the table. She didn't move it for a week. Her neighbor to the north was a man named Walt Pruitt, 72, with a limp from a hip he'd had replaced and then re-replaced, and wasn't entirely happy with either time. He appeared at her fence on her second morning with a jar of tomato preserves and the expression of a man making an assessment. "You the one that bought Ruth's place?" he said. It was not a question. "I didn't know her name," Margaret said. "Ruth Elander. Lived there 41 years. Taught school. Never married." He set the preserves on the top of the fence post. Good woman. Peculiar, some thought. But good. Margaret took the preserves. Walt leaned on the fence and told her things, the way older neighbors do, not intrusively, but helpfully, filling in the shape of a person she'd have to figure out from the things left behind. Ruth Elander had grown up in Ferris Creek, gone away to study teaching, come back. She had taught 3rd grade for 30 years, and after that she had gardened and read and walked to June's Juns, every morning for coffee and a piece of whatever was fresh. She had been quiet. She had been reliable. She had a thing she did, Walt said. Every Christmas, every Easter, people in town who needed a bit extra, she'd leave something. Just set it down at the door. Bag of groceries. Envelope, he paused. Didn't make a show of it. Half the people who got it didn't know where it came from until she died, because they only figured it out when it stopped. Margaret thought about that for a long time after Walt went back inside. She found a local man, Dewey Birch, who did structural work and didn't overcharge people who clearly couldn't afford to be overcharged. He had coffee with her in the kitchen, stepping carefully around the soft spot, and told her what needed doing in the order it needed doing. The floor first, then the windows, then the porch, then everything else. He was 58 and had been working on houses in Ferris Creek since his 20s, and he knew which problems would wait and which would not. The bones are good, he said. He said it the way someone says something true that they are glad about. Ruth kept up with what mattered. You're not dealing with a disaster. You're dealing with time. Margaret started work the next week. She did what she could herself. The painting, the clearing, the carrying, and Dewey did the rest on a schedule that bent around what she could pay. She was still bookkeeping, remotely now, for a firm in Columbus that didn't need her in an office, and the money came in steadily, which was the thing that mattered most. She was careful with it. She had always been careful with it. She cleaned through the house room by room, slowly, because the personal effects clause meant she had to go through Ruth Yolander's things herself. Most of it she handled with the care you give to objects that have outlasted the person who chose them. The books she kept, there were 240 of them, and she counted, because Margaret counted things. The kitchen things she kept, mostly, the cast-iron skillet, the mixing bowls, the 3 casserole dishes that stacked so neatly it would have seemed wrong to separate them, the clothes she folded and brought to the church on Maple Street that took donations without asking questions. She found small things, as you do, in drawers and at the back of shelves, a tin of buttons sorted by color, a birthday card from a student that said, "You are the best teacher I ever had," in the rounded letters of an 8-year-old. A recipe for apple cake written on an index card in Ruth's careful hand, with a note at the bottom that said "doubles well." She kept the recipe. She was not sure why, but she kept it. She had been in the house 3 weeks when she found the loose board in the upstairs hallway, not the baseboard in the kitchen, that came later. Just a floorboard that shifted underfoot with a hollow sound. She pried it up carefully and found nothing. A small space. Empty. Clean. As though it had been cleared. She set the board back down and thought nothing more of it. But later she would wonder if Ruth had kept something there once. Something she'd moved before the end. Something she'd reorganized and rethought, and finally placed differently. If this story is doing something to you, if you find yourself thinking about Ruth, about envelopes, about what it means to leave something behind for someone you'll never meet, please subscribe. It costs nothing, and it means we can keep telling stories like this one. And keep watching, because what Margaret found in that kitchen is something she never expected. It was in the 4th week, on a Tuesday, that she found the baseboard. She was painting the kitchen. The walls were a dingy yellow she was replacing with a soft white that made the room feel like it could breathe again, and she moved the standing shelf that Ruth had kept beside the stove. The baseboard behind it was slightly proud of the wall. Not dramatically, just enough that if you were looking, you'd notice. Margaret was the kind of person who noticed. She worked it loose carefully, not wanting to damage it. Behind it, in the space between the baseboard and the wall, was a row of envelopes, 14 of them, standing upright, the way you'd stand a row of books, kept in place by the pressure of the baseboard itself. They were sealed. They were labeled, in a handwriting that was precise and deliberate, the penmanship of a woman who had learned it when it was still taught properly, with numbers. 1 through 14. Margaret sat down on the kitchen floor. She sat there for a moment without doing anything, which was unlike her. Then she picked up envelope number 1. Inside was a single folded piece of paper and $300 in cash. The paper had writing on it, the same careful hand that said simply for the house. Start with what needs starting. She opened envelope 2. $350 and a note that said for the floor. Dewey Birch does good work. He is fair. She stopped breathing for a moment when she read that. She opened them all, one by one, and she counted every bill in every envelope, and she set each one down on the kitchen table in front of her as she went. Some envelopes had more, some had less, all had notes. For the porch, for the windows, for a mattress, sleep in a bed, not a chair. For Claire, if she visits. For a winter coat, if you need one. For the rose bush, it wants composting in spring, and it will come back to you. The last envelope, number 14, had no money in it. It had only a note, written in the same hand, and it said, I don't know who you'll be. But you came here with almost nothing, and you stayed. That means something. The house is glad to have you. I was glad to have it. Take care of each other. Margaret counted the cash. She counted it twice, because she was the kind of person who counted twice. It came to $4,840. She sat at that kitchen table for a long time. The cardinal was on the windowsill again, or maybe it was a different one. The soft spot in the floor was still there, although Dewey was scheduled for Friday, and after Friday it wouldn't be. She thought about Ruth Elander, who had taught 3rd grade for 30 years and never married, and walked to Junn's every morning and left things quietly at people's doors at Christmas without making a show of it. She thought about a woman who, knowing she was getting old, had sat down at this same table and counted out money and written notes and sealed them into envelopes and hid them behind a baseboard for whoever came next, who had thought about a stranger and tried to help her before she'd arrived, who had been good in the specific, invisible way that some people are good, which is the way that matters most. Harriet at Junn's confirmed what Walt had already half told her. Ruth had been doing it for years, the envelopes left at doors, the anonymous groceries, the quiet generosity that the town had grown so used to that its absence after her death had been its own kind of announcement. People had known, or had come to suspect, or had told themselves a version of events that let them accept kindness without feeling indebted. When Ruth died and the deliveries stopped, the silence had settled over Ferris Creek in a particular way. She never wanted a fuss about it, Harriet said. Said if you made a fuss, it became about you instead of them. Margaret thought about that. She thought about a woman who could see forward clearly enough to anticipate a stranger and write her notes by number, for the floor. Dewey Birch does good work. He is fair. She thought about the reading glasses on the kitchen table, the unfinished crossword. She thought about the rose bush, reaching up through the dead crabgrass on the first day. I am still here. There was a woman at the church on Maple, Mrs. Fontaine, who had known Ruth from the library reading group they'd both attended for years. She stopped Margaret one morning as Margaret was walking to Junn's and introduced herself by saying, "You're the one in Ruth's house," in a tone that was not unfriendly, but was careful, the way people are careful when something matters to them. They had coffee. Mrs. Fontaine told her about the reading group, about the arguments Ruth would have about books she didn't like, which was the thing about Ruth that surprised people. She was quiet. but she had opinions, and she expressed them directly and without apology, and then moved on. She had not been soft. She had been kind, which is not the same thing. She used to say, Mrs. Fontaine said, stirring her coffee, that a thing well made was an act of love. She said it about her teaching, and she said it about her garden, and she said it about the books she chose. She looked at Margaret. I think she believed it about her house, too. Margaret used that phrase sometimes after that, quietly, to herself. A thing well made. She thought about it when she was patching plaster, when she was squaring the porch boards, when she was composting around the rose bush in April, the way the 14th envelope had said to do. She used Dewey's envelope money for Dewey, because Ruth had known about Dewey, and that seemed right. She used the floor money for the floor. She used the window money for the windows. She bought a mattress, a good one, not the cheapest, and she slept in the bedroom for the first time in 5 weeks, and woke up not sure, for one moment, where she was, and then remembered and lay there a little while with that feeling. The room had a window that faced east. She hadn't noticed that until the light came through it. She kept Ruth's books on Ruth's shelves. She fixed the porch herself, mostly, with guidance from a YouTube video and a borrowed level. She composted around the rose bush in April, the way the notes said, and in May it came back. 10 blooms on the south facing canes, a dark red that was almost wine-colored. Claire came in June, for a week. She was 23 and finishing her master's degree, and she had her father's eyes and her mother's way of going quiet when something mattered. And when Margaret showed her the envelopes, all 14, laid out on the kitchen table in order, Claire went very quiet for a long time. She didn't know you, Claire said finally. No, Margaret said. She just knew someone was coming. Yes, Claire looked at the last note for a while. Then she looked at the rose bush through the kitchen window, which was in full bloom and visible from where they sat. Are you okay, Mom? She said, and the way she said it meant something bigger than the question. I think I am, Margaret said. And she was surprised, when she said it, to find that she meant it. It was Walt who told her about the Hartley family, that September, in the way that Walt told her most things, leaning on the fence in no particular hurry, as if information was best delivered that way. The Hartleys had 3 kids, and the father had been hurt at work, and the mother was holding things together with both hands and not enough help. Margaret thought about it for 2 days. On the 3rd day, she put together a bag. She left it at their door in the evening, when no one was likely to be watching, and she set it down and walked away. She didn't knock. She didn't leave a note. She had thought about leaving a note, but then thought that Ruth hadn't. And Ruth had known something about this. She told no one. She walked home. The night was cool, and the leaves were starting, and the light from her kitchen window was on when she came up the path, the warm yellow of it, and she stopped for a moment to look at it. A house with its light on. Her house, with the porch level now, and the windows that didn't rattle, and the rose bush asleep for the winter but ready, she knew, to come back. Dennis had called, twice, since the summer. Both times from the same number, which meant the calls were deliberate. She'd let them go to voicemail. The first message was brief and polite, and said nothing. The second said he'd heard she'd bought a place somewhere, and that he was glad to hear it, and that he hoped she was well. She'd listened to it twice and then deleted it, not with anger, but with the quiet clarity of a woman who knows what she needs and what she doesn't. Her sister had called, too. Margaret had answered that one. Her sister was pleased, in the way that people are pleased when something turns out better than they feared, and they can finally say so. Margaret was glad. She didn't need much more than that. She had everything she needed, here, on Mill Road, in a house that had been left with almost nothing, and had turned out to hold quite a lot. That was the thing about places that look abandoned from the outside. Sometimes they are simply waiting for the right person to arrive and stay long enough to find out what's inside. She had a good lamp on the side table by the wingback chair. She had 240 books on a shelf in the front room. She had a casserole dish that smelled like her mother's kitchen if she held it close. And she used it now, and the kitchen smelled that way more often. She had Dewey coming by every few months to check on things, and Harriet at Junn's who refilled her coffee without being asked, and Walt at the fence who told her things in no particular hurry because he had time, and so did she. She had a rose bush that knew how to come back. She was 42 now, which is not old and is not young, and she had lost a great deal, and she had found, behind a baseboard, that someone she had never met had been thinking about her before she'd arrived. That was not a small thing. Margaret was a woman who counted things, and she knew it was not small. Some things that look like endings are only the long pause before the next thing starts. Margaret had believed that. She had needed to believe it, and she had not always been certain it was true. Now she was more certain. She sat in the wingback chair on the last evening of October with tea going cold beside her, and a book open in her lap, and the rose bush outside already bare for the winter, and the kitchen light warm on the ceiling. And she thought, I am exactly where I should be, not where she had planned, not where anyone had expected, just where she should be. She had started from almost nothing. $43 and a birthday card, 32 of them handed over for a cottage that everyone thought was beyond saving. And here she was, on the other side of a year that had taken everything from her and handed her something she hadn't known to look for. If there is someone reading this or listening who is in the middle of their own $43 and a broken zipped suitcase moment, this story is for you. Not because the envelopes are coming. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But because the leap is worth taking. Because the things that look empty sometimes aren't. And because sometimes the person who was there before you has already thought of what you'll need. If this story meant something to you, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Share it with someone who needs a quiet reminder that things can change. And leave a comment telling us this. Has someone ever helped you without you knowing it was them? Until later. We'd love to hear it. We'll see you in the next one.